Hello, in this video I'll talk about how the woke view of knowledge is problematic. In other words, I'll talk about how critical social justice ideology and postmodernism, which are the intellectual foundations for wokeism, are confused about knowledge and why that matters. My premise is that we require some form of reliable knowledge to function, make decisions, and act. This is necessary for individuals, but it's also necessary that groups and societies have some form of shared knowledge for the same reason. This is necessary even if our knowledge is not ultimately or universally true. In this sense, knowledge is not just about what is true, but also about what has practical or pragmatic value. Knowledge matters. Later, I'll borrow from the integral theory of Ken Wilber and contextualize my critique of woke epistemology within a plurality of valid epistemological methods and the different kinds of knowledge that they produce in different domains. Please stick around for this because it'll provide further clarity and coherence for what I am about to say. Along the way, I will also talk about other forms of epistemic confusion other than those of the woke. At the end, I'll talk about forms of epistemic confusion that have been part of the history of psychotherapy. The woke are not the only ones to have been confused about knowledge. Basically, epistemology deals with the nature of knowledge and how it is produced. It asks, what do we know and how do we know it? The woke confusion about this boils down to two positions that it holds. The first is its argument that knowledge cannot be asserted to be ultimately or universally true because it is socially constructed. The woke also argue that the methods by which knowledge is gained and the truths that it declares are used by a powerful elite, perhaps on behalf of some dominant group, to marginalize and oppress a less powerful group. This, they say, is the inherent motive behind any assertions of knowledge or truth, especially according to radical postmodernism. Rather than have its own epistemology, it specializes in deconstructing any claims to knowledge and how that knowledge has been produced. It claims that it offers several of its own epistemologies. However, all but one of these are not methods for producing knowledge. They are methods for deconstructing whatever knowledge has been produced by others. These go by the names of social constructivism, deconstruction, epistemic relativism, and genealogy. I won't get into all of these. You can look them up if you're interested. My point is that they are all critical deconstructions of the validity of knowledge and how it is produced. This could be useful. It could be a useful first step toward revising our knowledge for the purpose of solving new and emerging problems. But it offers nothing constructive for that revision. It's just a way to know that what we know isn't true, with the exception that we can know that we don't know. The other confusion, which contradicts the first one by making a claim to knowledge, is that the woke privilege the only real epistemology that they do offer, standpoint epistemology. This points to the truth inherent to lived experience. It's argued that this addresses the problem with asserting any ultimate or universal truths, which it sees as inherently oppressive. There are two problems with this. First, it fails to recognize the need for shared truths and affirms only subjective individual truths. It also restricts this to those who are deemed to be oppressed. The lived experience or standpoint of any other individual or group cannot claim to have valid knowledge. Also, the claims that can be made in the name of standpoint epistemology reach beyond a person's lived experience and allow them to make much broader claims. The claim is not just, this is what I feel and I think. For instance, that I am distressed because I believe I have suffered a microaggression. It goes further by claiming something about another person's subjectivity. For example, that the other person was racist due to implicit bias. Or it makes a claim about the broader society in terms of systemic racism or some otherism. There is no epistemic requirement for evidence for these broader claims beyond the feeling and assumption that it is true. This does not constitute a credible epistemology. That word is merely tacked on to give it a sense of validity when it makes unwarranted claims. What a person can know through introspection is what they feel in response to something that happened to them and what they think about it. That is the evidence that validates only what they felt and thought, not the motivations of another or the general state of society. Similarly, a person whose identity is one of privilege, but whose lived experience does not validate any privilege, they cannot make a claim that people with that same oppressor identity are also not privileged. That would require further evidence, which is the hallmark of any reliable epistemology. The reason we need knowledge and knowledge-producing methods or epistemologies is because we need to diagnose and solve problems. And this establishes the ground for inventing practices or praxes that are effective for that purpose. To deconstruct epistemologies in the name of overcoming oppressive dominant cultures without addressing the need for groups and cultures to have shared knowledge for diagnosing and solving problems, making decisions, and taking action is to cripple the collective. Recognizing this leads me to further thoughts about standpoint epistemology. It's focused on the lived experience of individuals who belong to marginalized groups or cultures, overlooks something. The assumption seems to be that within marginalized groups there are no oppressive norms or knowledge claims, no assertions of universal truths, no epistemologies that need to be deconstructed. There are no grand narratives. Individuals in such groups, it thinks, would be automatically liberated, if not for the dominant culture that they live in. Maybe. Or maybe they would just be free to be oppressed by their own group. The reality is that there is no such thing as a purely individual standpoint, perspective, or experience. Everything we feel, think, believe, or do is a product of our internalization of the knowledge given to us by our culture. This includes linguistic constructions, beliefs about what is important, moral codes, and what is real and what is not. We may develop to the point of being able to question these things, but we can't develop to that point without having first internalized them and then made them an object of our awareness. Our ability to question these things and the cognitive tools used to do this are themselves cultural artifacts that we've learned. Along with critical thinking tools in general, this also includes critical theory and postmodernism, which are also, by the way, cultural constructions. Standpoint epistemology does not apply itself to a critique of the epistemologies inherent to marginalized groups. The very same potential power dynamics that are identified for dominant groups also apply equally within marginalized groups. This is true because all groups and cultures need to rely on some form of shared knowledge that provides reliable methods for solving problems, making decisions, and meeting their needs. Such knowledge and praxis are acquired cumulatively over generations through trial and error. Because errors are costly, there is cultural incentive to stick with what is proven to work. For a group to adopt knowledge and praxis from an individual that doesn't accord with its hard-won traditions, it must be persuaded that such new ideas are grounded in an accepted notion of truth or reality, and that they serve the group's functioning and well-being. To entertain any idiosyncratic ideas in the name of equality and liberation from oppressive social norms without such persuasion will seem to be madness or evil, in any case not smart or prudent or wise. It will be resisted. To interpret this resistance as merely oppressive is to have one's head either in the sand or cloud. My point is that even so-called marginalized groups have a need for reliable knowledge and praxis, for shared beliefs, for grand narratives, for truths they hold to be true across space and time, at least for themselves. And those who hold to indigenous beliefs and wisdom also see those with different knowledge and life ways as wrong and hold their own members accountable for complying with the wisdom and wishes of their own ancestors. I challenge anyone to show me an indigenous group that holds views equivalent to a postmodern deconstructionist approach. Postmodernism's standpoint epistemology turns a blind eye to this. It doesn't point an accusing finger at those oppressive cultures. Yet it does point such a finger at the modern scientific revolution and its epistemologies. Once upon a time, the empirical method was a threatening new idea. It was resisted. People were persecuted as heretics, held back their ideas for fear of persecution, or had their work banned. For instance, Galileo, Copernicus, Kepler, and Descartes. But slowly, their ideas were persuasive. Slowly, the scientific method showed itself capable of providing for the functioning and well-being of the group. Medicine, technology, and engineering all helped to diagnose and solve problems and offered new, reliable methods for meeting human needs. This turned out to be more effective for many problems than pre-modern and religious knowledge and praxis. It was a monumental achievement that had to overcome the oppression of thousands of years of tradition. That's why we call it a revolution. The scientific revolution had a profound emancipatory impact on the human quest for knowledge. It broke the spell of long-held dogmatic beliefs that were indigenous to the cultures that gave it birth. It offered itself democratically to all who wished to engage in it, regardless of social station. Beyond this, it also came with a built-in process for self-correcting, so that all knowledge produced could be questioned and modified if shown to be false or could be replaced by something that worked better. It's a myopic view of critical theory and postmodernism to see empirical science as a mere tool for the colonization and oppression of indigenous cultures. Any tool, no matter how bright and shiny, can be used for evil purposes. This doesn't mean that there is something inherently wrong with a tool. I saw Hagar the Horrible cartoon once where Hagar's sidekick suggested to Hagar that he pound his sword into a plowshare. Hagar thinks about this for a moment and says, yes, a plowshare could do a lot of damage. But according to postmodernism, modernism is merely an oppressive system that marginalizes the pre-modern knowledge and wisdom of indigenous cultures. There is no such thing as a better way to gain knowledge, solve problems, or contribute to the well-being of humanity. All ways should be given equal value and have equal say. Evidence be damned. What I think needs to be recognized is that so far the scientific method has proven itself to be the best we have come up with for producing certain kinds of knowledge. It's great when it comes to the material world. In terms of physics and biology, it's king. The problem, however, is that this is not the only important domain of knowledge. I will explain this shortly. Thinking that science can explain everything is what Ken Wilber in integral theory calls quadrant reductionism or absolutism. Wilber also calls it flatland, as everything is reduced to mere surfaces without any interiority, subjectivity, or consciousness. No spirit, no divinity, no sacredness, no aught that can be derived from any is. When materialistic science and its epistemology deny the validity of any other domain of knowledge, I believe that modernism can fairly be accused of being oppressive. This is a good example of how emancipatory revolutions can become the next tyrannies, despite the valuable perspectives that they may offer. At the same time, subjective truths rooted in interiority, should stay in their own lanes and not try to explain everything by their own domain and epistemology. This is just another form of quadrant absolutism. Ideally, if exterior and interior epistemologies were humble enough to recognize the limits of their own domains, there could be a dialogue between them. This could reveal correlations between the different sets of knowledge that each produce. It could allow us to see that these different facets or dimensions contribute to the understanding that we are looking at the same thing from different perspectives. If this were to happen, I would call it an integral revolution, which isn't to say that that is the end of the line, but it might be the next step. To make more sense of what I've said so far, I want to introduce what Wilber calls integral methodological pluralism. This is a framework for acknowledging different domains and the epistemologies or methods used to produce knowledge, different kinds of knowledge in each one. Because critical theory and postmodernism are allergic to any such grand narratives or frameworks, this integral model has been harshly critiqued as oppressive. What critical theory and postmodernism fail to appreciate is that it delivers on what they claim to value but can't offer, an inclusive embrace of multiple epistemologies. I'll start by describing the four quadrants. When it comes to human beings, we can recognize that we have an exterior and an interior. The exterior refers to our physical, biological body. The interior refers to our subjectivity, our mind, or consciousness, and all its contents in terms of thoughts and feelings. We can also recognize that we're individuals, but we're embedded in and part of our culture, society, or collective. If we put these two pairs of dimensions on intersecting axes, we get the interior of the individual, the exterior of the individual, the interior of the collective, and the exterior of the collective. In more common language, we could say we get the psychological, the biological, the cultural, and the environmental. Included in environment is social infrastructure and institutions as well as ecology. Sometimes I just call the quadrants mind, body, relationships, and environment. Once we recognize these four quadrants, we can also recognize that each one contains its own kind of knowledge. Accessing or producing knowledge in each one also requires different methods or epistemologies. There isn't time to explain each one, but I will name some of the methods that correspond with each quadrant. Although each quadrant has a different focus and method for gaining knowledge, they all adhere to the same basic epistemological standard of following an injunction or conducting an experiment, obtaining data or information, interpreting that data, and getting validation for that interpretation from those qualified and knowledgeable in that domain. For the sake of brevity, I will only provide a sample of the different focuses and methodologies that correspond to each quadrant. Don't worry if you're not familiar with some of these terms. This is just a sketch or impression so that you can begin to have an idea of what belongs where. For the upper left quadrant, or mind, the focus is on the I space of the interior, subjective experiences of the individual. This includes thoughts, emotions, intentions, and consciousness. The methods for exploring this include introspection, phenomenology, contemplative practices, dream analysis, psychodynamic introspection, and journaling or reflective writing. Verification is established when an interpretation or insight illuminates or makes sense of one's inner world and is confirmed intersubjectively through shared experiences with others. For instance, meditators corroborating the stages of mindfulness experiences. An insight is also pragmatically validated if it leads to meaningful change in an individual's life. For the upper left quadrant, or body, the focus is on observable and measurable phenomena in the physical world, for instance, the body. Methods include scientific experimentation and measurement, observation of biological and behavioral processes, neuroimaging, and statistical analysis. Verification is established through reproducibility, falsifiability, and peer-reviewed studies. For the lower left quadrant, or culture, the focus is on the we space of shared meaning, values, worldviews, norms, and mutual understanding among individuals within a group. Methods include hermeneutics, phenomenology, ethnography, cultural anthropology, and dialogue and discourse analysis, to name a few. Verification is established through communal agreement. The adequacy of interpretation is judged by its richness, coherence, and ability to account for multiple perspectives. Interpretations must not only resonate with a group, but also serve a practical purpose in enhancing communication, mutual understanding, or group cohesion. And for the lower right quadrant, the focus is on systems, networks, structures, and institutional dynamics that govern collective behavior and relationships, as well as the ecological systems they are embedded in. Methods include systems theory, structural functionalism, empirical sociology, economics, and ecology. Verification is established by how well the analysis of data explains and predicts system behavior and accounts for the interrelations and integrity of the system studied. Perhaps you notice that verification is different for left-hand or inner quadrants, where there is no hard measurable data. Interpretations of the soft, unquantifiable data of subjective experiences cannot be empirically verified or falsified in the same way. Verification relies on a consensus interpretation. Even if a more accurate, comprehensive, and coherent interpretation is offered, it can be rejected simply because that's not what most people think. This is where postmodernism can come and crack that nut. But that's all it can do. It doesn't recognize that the consensus was formed not necessarily based on an ultimate truth claim. Subjective truths can be relatively easily deconstructed. The consensus may claim something to be true, but the reason for the consensus is pragmatic. Knowledge is not only for the sake of truth, it is for the purpose of living. The reasons people agreed on certain interpretations is because they served a purpose. They facilitated social cohesion, harmony, and cooperation. They provided meaning and purpose to individuals. They quelled the trembling existential terrors of life. Likewise, for a new interpretation to gain acceptance, it must not only demonstrate that it is a superior, more comprehensive, coherent, sensible, and elegant alternative version of the truth, it must argue also for its pragmatic value. It must be useful. My intention in sharing this is merely to persuade you that there are different valid forms of knowledge and different valid ways of acquiring it. Within the context of this understanding, the limits and confusions of the woke view of knowledge are clearer. At the same time, we can also make a limited place for standpoint epistemology and recognize the value of postmodernism's deconstructionism. It provides the first step toward overcoming the limits of old knowledge in the pursuit of new and better knowledge. As promised in the beginning, I want to address some historical epistemological confusions within the field of psychiatry, mental health, and psychotherapy. These all come in the form of quadrant reductionisms. I'm not just picking on wokeism here. I'll keep this brief, even though it's a vast topic. In terms of the upper right quadrant, or body, the biomedical model has tried to reduce psychological distress to brain disease and neurological dysfunction. The solution to that problem, among other things, is primarily psychopharmacological, i.e. drugs. Another example of this quadrant, although it has largely fallen out of favor, is behaviorism. For both examples, there is a neglect of psychological, cultural, and social dimensions. In the upper left quadrant, or mind, there can be almost exclusive focus on intrapsychic processes. There is an over-reliance on talk therapy that focuses on introspection or emotional processing without addressing biological imbalances or systemic influences, the role of medication, or external supports. It focuses purely on self-discovery methods. In the lower left, or relationship quadrant, psychotherapy can exclusively favor interpersonal and cultural explanations and solutions to clients' problems. There was a time when family systems theory came along to address the intrapsychic domination of psychoanalysis, and it provided another perspective. In time, it became the dominant model for many therapists, and people began to raise the question, what happened to the individual? Another reduction to this quadrant occurs when all problems are diagnosed as reduced to cultural explanations. This is especially for wokeism. The oppressive nature of cultural norms and narratives explain a client's distress. The solution is to raise the client's critical consciousness and recruit them for social activism. In the lower right quadrant, or environment, mental health can be seen as a function of social determinants like poverty or access to health care. Ecopsychology sees psychological distress as a dissociation from the world of nature. Apart from ecopsychology, however, psychotherapy has generally neglected this quadrant. Although sometimes concerning itself with economic class, this is an area that woke psychotherapy could take up more than it does, than it has, and make a positive contribution. Thankfully, the so-called biopsychosocial model gained popularity in the 70s, and many practitioners adopted it as a better model than a reductionism to one or the other of the quadrants. Even so, it's my perception that there's still a lot of quadrant favoritism, if not reductionism, in the field. My point is not that knowledge from any of the quadrants is wrong or not useful. My point is that we unnecessarily restrict our knowledge and praxis when we rely on any fewer than all four quadrants. This is the problem with the woke understanding of knowledge, and as I have described, they are not the only ones with this epistemic confusion. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. I know this may have been a lot to try to follow and process, but I hope that it has given you a useful way to think about knowledge, what it is, how it is produced, and why it matters. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Bye for now.